This chapter is all about reviewing cells. So at this point we've reviewed the plasma membrane. Let's go ahead and move inside of the cell to the internal environment at looking at the cytoplasm. Okay, so what does the cytoplasm of a cell actually include? If you had to just stop and think about that for a minute, cytoplasm, what does cytoplasm include? Okay, so definitely a couple of key things should be coming to mind. Definitely the organelles are included in the cytoplasm. Let's just make a list here. The organelles of the cell, which we will be taking a look at in this video. We'll review the organelles. The cytoplasm also includes the cytosol. Whoops, let me just erase that. The cytosol of the cell is the fluid portion, cytosol. So this is the liquid that the organelles sort of float in. And then some other things that you may or may not have thought of as being part of the cytoplasm, the cytoskeleton, this network of like microtubules and microfilaments, this fibrous network that exists is also part of the cytoskeleton. So let's get that on our list as well. Cytoskeleton. And then finally, I'm just going to list inclusions. What is this talking about? Inclusions are stored bodies of things. Like we could be talking about stored glucose in the form of glycogen. The cell would probably have an inclusion where it stores that glycogen. We could be talking about stored triglycerides. All of those would be stored in inclusions, which are in the cytoplasm. Okay, so let's talk about the cytoskeleton for just a minute. The cytoskeleton, in some cases, tends to be underappreciated. It actually does a lot of very important things. So we're going to start by looking at the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is a network. It's a whole system of microtubules and microfilaments that extend throughout the cytoplasm of the cell. So if you just look at this picture on the right for a minute, this is showing a few different cells. The red is sort of showing the outline of a cell. So here is one cell, and what we have stained in blue is the nucleus, and what we have stained in green is the cytoskeleton. So you can see the skeleton really does go all throughout the cell. And this does a number of important things. It helps to just keep things organized. It allows organization inside of the cell. And it also allows a lot of transport. So I have here, it's serving as a railway system. There are literally, each of these microtubules acts like a tract. And there are little proteins that can move along those tracts and carry things. So the proteins that can move along, they're a special grouping of motor proteins. They're called kinesins and dyneins. Kinesins and dyneins are the main ones. Myosin also, this is going to come up when we talk about muscles. So all of those are molecular motors that move along the cytoskeleton, and they can do things like carry vesicles with them. The kinesins and dyneins, this is how vesicles are moved throughout the cell, is by being transported along the cytoskeleton. Another thing that the cytoskeleton does that you should already be aware of is it helps to form, it forms the spindle apparatus that's needed for moving around chromosomes during mitosis. We'll see that a little bit later on in this chapter. All right, in some special cases, the cytoskeleton is what allows cells to move. So we already talked a little bit about phagocytosis in this chapter. Some cells can phagocytose other things, and the way that that happens, the way that they form pseudopodia, is by pushing out their cytoskeleton in that direction, and that causes the rest of the cell body to sort of flow wherever the cytoskeleton is going. Muscle cells, we will talk about these in far more detail when we get to the muscle chapter. Let's look at some of the organelles inside of the cell. So we're just going to really quick here go through a few organelles. We've got lysosomes and peroxisomes. At a glance, these look like vesicles. Okay, here's a vesicle. Over here is labeled a lysosome. They look kind of like the same thing. They're just little membrane-bound structures. However, inside of a lysosome, there's something special. Lysosomes always have digestive enzymes inside of them. And what they do is they clean up the cellular environment. They digest old organelles that are worn out, no longer working quite properly. And they can also digest molecules molecules, foreign molecules, or cellular molecules that have been tagged for destruction. Peroxisomes, on the other hand, these are primarily for detox purposes. We have a lot of peroxisomes in our livers, and they have enzymes inside. The enzyme that we'll be looking at later on in the course is catalase. Catalase is what helps the liver to detox a lot of things that move through it. So different function. At a glance, they look the same. They both look similar to vesicles, but they have different things stored inside. Lysosomes and peroxisomes. Let's move on to mitochondria. What do mitochondria do? You should know this already. Mitochondria are very important for producing ATP in our cells, so very important for converting energy into a usable form that our cells can use. More detail on that later on. Ribosomes, very important component of the cytoplasm. Ribosomes, what do they do? All right, synthesize proteins. We've got ribosomes in a number of different locations in the cell. An example would be on the rough endoplasmic reticulum, which is our next organelle. So the endoplasmic reticulum, we've got two different varieties of endoplasmic reticulum in our cells. Some is rough and some is smooth. So in the schematic here, showing the difference between those two, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or rough ER, it is usually abbreviated. This is primarily for protein synthesis, and it's called rough because it has ribosomes studding the surface. So ribosomes are actually embedded in the membrane of the rough ER. And those ribosomes produce protein. Okay, the smooth ER. It's called smooth because it does not have ribosomes. And what does the smooth ER do? Very different job. The smooth ER is more involved in synthesis of lipids inside of the cell. And then it also is a storage location for calcium ions. And we'll be seeing a lot of that when we get to the chapter on muscles. This is a storage location for calcium, which is needed for muscle contractions to work. The Golgi apparatus is in purple on this figure. And let's just sort of follow the pathway. We were talking about ribosomes and the rough ER just a moment ago. Ribosomes on the rough ER, okay, they will produce proteins. Those proteins would get packaged into vesicles, which would then get shipped off to the Golgi. Okay, so the Golgi is going to receive those proteins. It may carry out modifications on them, chemically modify them. It might do things like attach a carbohydrate group, so turn it into a glycoprotein. Remember, we said glycoproteins are important components of the plasma membrane. Okay, so modifications take place in the Golgi. And then what the Golgi does is it packages molecules into a new vesicle and ships them off. So sends them along the cytoskeleton out to wherever they need to go. So it could be sending some membrane proteins out to the membrane, the plasma membrane. And then when the vesicle fuses with the membrane, suddenly we've got the glycoprotein or whatever it is embedded in the membrane, right where it's supposed to be. So that's the Golgi. It's usually referred to as it's kind of like the UPS of the cell. It receives things, it sorts them, and then it ships them out where they're supposed to go.